presentation of the center, the Alva Myrdal Center for Nuclear Disarmament, where Peter and myself work at the moment. And it's the center that basically helped in drafting and publishing the book that we are launching here in front of you today. Let me just see. So that's, it works right. So a few words I would want to say about the center itself. So Alva Myrdal Center for Nuclear Disarmament, or AMC as we'll refer to it from now on for issues of simplicity, takes the name of Alva Myrdal, who was a Swedish cabinet minister. She was a diplomat, as you know. She was an activist, a writer, and a minister in government, occupying various positions. But of course, she was also from Uppsala. That's the reason why also the center takes the name, her name. The Alva Myrdal Center for Nuclear Disarmament studies the whole process in which nuclear disarmament occurs, preconditions and hurdles, negotiations and decision-making, implementation and verification. It strives to be as interdisciplinary as we can, which is also reflected on some of the products that are coming, hopefully in the near future, one of which is an edited volume on inspections and verification. What we try to do there is combine the expertise and the knowledge of scholars and practitioners from different sort of disciplines and areas, not just peace and conflict or international relations and political science, but also nuclear physics. So that's sort of an up-and-coming product which will follow the edited volume that we are launching here today. As Tom said, the AMC, the Alva Myrdal Center for Nuclear Disarmament, is a sort of a loosely based network of right now actually 8 working groups. It used to be 5 or 6 initially, and then it grew to 7, and now it's 8 working groups. Each of these working groups comprised of working group leaders focusing on specific areas related to nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, such as the first one on negotiations. I will get back to working group 2 for obvious reasons in a little bit. Then we have data on nuclear rivalries, negotiations and agreements, which is working group 3. We have a working group specifically focusing on nuclear physics, working group 4. The latest one, which was added literally a few days ago, was working group 8 on international AI governance. Each of these working groups is comprised, as I said, of Uppsala University, but not only working group leaders, but then each working group is comprised of a number of scholars and practitioners who work from all over the world, including ours, which is working group 2 on international measures for compliance to nuclear disarmament regimes, or essentially sanctions and nuclear disarmament. And Tom is a member of that working group as well as, of course, Peter as leader and myself. Which brings me to the actual edited volume, the reason why we are here today. It's been sort of a labor of love, as they say. We've been working on this really for the last 2.5 years. All of us. It's comprised of 12 contributing authors, each of them writing chapters or co-writing chapters within the book. The idea with the book was to provide a multidisciplinary perspective on sanctions literature, on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation, on history, peace and conflict, as well as political science. The book generally is comprised of 2 parts. The first one is sort of the theoretical part, where we discuss some of the issues related to sanctions, challenges to do with sanctions, what sort of sanctions there are, the legitimacy, legality around sanctions, and so on and so forth. And then the second part of the book is comprised of a number of chapters that discuss specific case studies, such as Pakistan, North Korea, Iran, India, Brazil, South Africa, and so on. And I think, just to sort of set the scene, I think, and before I give the floor to Peter and then back to Tom, as we said in the book, in the introductory chapter, of course, we wanted to position the book in the current context, as we know what is happening in the world today in the last few years. provide sort of a context on the current affairs, political affairs. We ask that basic question, which is in everyone's mind at the moment, whether we are witnessing a re-emerging nuclear arms race. What is happening with the international nuclear arms regime is clear. I think the evidence is clear that it's weakening by the day. And so what does this mean for the sanctions regime in general? What does it mean for the multipolar world in general? And what does it mean for treaties such as the New START Treaty, which is due to expire in a couple of years? What does it mean whether the prospects of it being renewed are realistic or not? So with that question, I would hand over to Peter to continue with the actual content of the book.
Thank you very much, Armend. And I want to reinforce my gratitude that we have a chance to present this to you, and I'm looking forward to your input and reactions. For me, this is a good starting point. This is the statistics of armed conflicts that is produced at the Uppsala Conflict Data Program in Uppsala, obviously, in the same department. And here you can see one way of illustrating the situation we are in right now. This is the total number of armed conflict with the same definition going across space and time, so to say, from 1946. And what you see here is the extent of armed conflict going on simultaneously in the world year by year. And the last few years, you can say basically since 2014, we have been on an unusually high number of armed conflicts, more than 50 going on. And in 2023, we recorded 59. So we'll see what will be recorded once we calculate 2024. And you can also see in this that this is historically very high level of armed conflict, and that it has continued for several years, almost 10 years on that high level. So it means, I think, that we are in the midst of a major transformation of the international system, the way it has worked. And one needs to think a lot about what to do about this. And of course, sanctions are part of this with conflicts in one way or another. There are elements in conflict, or they are part of potential conflicts. When we talk about non-proliferation issues, these are, of course, conflicts which are not necessarily armed conflict at this time, but they are definitely significant disputes with a lot of potential of becoming much stronger. So here is a couple of points that we address in these chapters about the different functions and the different roles that sanctions can play with respect to some operations. And of course, the key question is, are these sanctions, so to say, effective in preventing proliferation of nuclear weapons, or are they not? Are they instead rather reinforcing existing disputes and make them even more difficult? So we, of course, also, you can say, separate between different types of sanctions, where one is the more instrumental one, which is using the sanctions as a way of improving, strengthening your position in a negotiation, and where you can turn them off and on in a very instrumental way, or sanctions that are much more expressive, that really just expresses your condemnation or your statement that you dislike what somebody's doing. And of course, these sanctions will have quite a different kind of impact. And as Tom told about these various sanctions processes, they, of course, in a sense, depart from the idea that sanctions are instrumental. They are there in order to achieve certain goals which are possible to specify, and in that sense become part of a negotiation at some level. So what we have focused here is then on proliferation and non-proliferation issues. And here you have some of the cases that we are dealing with, and it's all largely based on case analysis. So one could say that if you look at this in a historical perspective, when the Non-Proliferation Treaty was negotiated and achieved in 1968. It was against the backdrop of some potentially nuclear weapon states being in the vicinity of 30 or so. And of course, we today have 9, so it's still extremely interesting to understand how come that the whole set of countries that were potentially capable of producing nuclear weapons, in fact, did not instead agreed to the NPT formula. But we also have a whole set of cases where countries stayed outside the NPT or left the NPT. And that still remains the largest and, in a sense, most successful kind of treaty that we have in the field of nuclear weapons, as it is a global arrangement, and countries have stayed in it most countries have stayed in it for 50 years. So it's interesting in itself to ask how come that they did. Normally in the literature is focusing a lot on cases where obvious proliferation was close to being achieved and did not happen. And these are some of the cases of interest. Libya, of course, had an advanced program which was stopped with the help of sanctions in the early 2000s. The same with South Africa, which actually produced nuclear weapons, but with the taking of power of ANC in 1994, scrapped its whole program. Ukraine, of course, is a particularly important case in this context. Through the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, Ukraine agreed to give up those nuclear explosives that they had on that territory in return for a guarantee of their territorial integrity and political independence. Of course, an agreement at that time regarded as really very important and significant, and completely violated by Russia through the invasion in 2022 in particular. Syria also had such a program of developing their own nuclear weapons, and this was basically stopped through military action by Israel bombing the key facilities. So here are the whole set of cases, but in a sense one could also regard the Non-Proliferation Treaty itself as a case to study. And the one we have looked at in this project is West Germany. West Germany, that's the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1960s and 1970s, where it is quite interesting. You can say Germany was always a central actor in the whole history of nuclear weapons. I mean, that's the main reason, the potential that Germany under Nazi control could develop its own nuclear weapons and be the first one to do it, was really the argument for the whole Manhattan Project and for the United States to develop, together with UK, Canada and some others, to develop their own nuclear weapon. And of course, Germany did not get a nuclear weapon during the Second World War. And many of those scientists that were involved in this process in the late 30s and the early 40s, in the 1950s, again see the possibility that Germany would again be interested in a nuclear weapons program. And you can say that the NPT at that time is partly seen as a way of blocking Germany from getting nuclear weapons. But in return, one gets this possibility to develop nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. It's an interesting debate and discussion that one could really look more carefully at, and we have one contribution doing that, and I think in that sense opening up for thinking a little more about the history also of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. And we have a whole set of cases we also go into where countries for various reasons have chosen to develop their own programs and not be part of the NPT. And where also sanctions have been applied, and the hope that with sanctions one achieve and prevent those ambitions, which we have to say, not necessarily very successful. So that gives us a lot of material to look at on the utility of sanctions. And so then we need to specify a little what is the purpose of these sanctions. And as I said, basically we are looking at them as sort of instrumental measures to prevent proliferation. And you can say they are helpful in pushing actors, governments to start negotiations. The threat of sanctions can start to get them to get into that. But it can also, while you are in the negotiations, you can also use the sanctions or the threat of sanctions as a way of pushing them on particular issues in the negotiations. And of course, the idea is that do not push too hard so that they leave, feel offended, and draw conclusion that they will not achieve anything, a reasonable deal, so to say. So you keep them at the table, but you don't push them off the table. And once there is an agreement, many times there will be clauses, provisions that specify that this violation of various agreements should be or could be exposed to further sanctions. And that is also part of supervising, so to say, monitoring the implementation of these agreements. You can say sanctions come in at the whole process, in the whole process of negotiating agreements. And that means that is what we then refer to as compliance. So there are, as I mentioned, threats of various sorts, and threats of sanctions. There could even be a threat of military action. That's different from actually applying sanctions or military measures. Application of sanctions can then be either very targeted or very comprehensive, very limited or very comprehensive. The sanctions movements that we have been involved in has particularly focused on making targeted sanctions, focus on a particular individual or particular commodities rather than sealing off a country in its entirety. And that was the purpose, for instance, on the Stockholm process, which we ran 2001 to 2003 and presented in the UN Security Council. It was to make the sanctions, so to say, operative in terms of how you block financial assets, how you prevent violations of visa restrictions and all these kind of things. Of course, then the whole idea was to do it within the UN framework. I'll come back to that. But of course, one can also, and as I gave you examples of, there is also a spectrum of military action that you can use to prevent the proliferation. But that will oftentimes lead to the danger of having an armed conflict around these issues. So comprehensive sanctions, the idea with them and what we can see historically is that when you try to seal off a country in its entirety, it often leads to the opposite effect. It antagonizes, it moves people or governments further away, and it often leads to a rallying behind the existing government. And it also leads to the existing government being able to take particular measures to prevent the sanctions from having an effect, and do that with legal or instruments or police or military. And the idea then with the targeted sanction was that it would only target those that are really responsible for the negotiations or for the policies as such, and get them to get the harm in order to avoid harming a whole population, so to say. And that's the hope, of course, is that if you target certain parts of a government, for instance, it may divide a government, make it more possible for some kind of change of opinion, etc. So there are two very different kinds of dynamics in these types of sanctions. And this is then the number of sanctions we have seen since the end of the Cold War, when sanctions started to be used. These are the UN authorized sanctions. And of course, the UN sanctions are those which have the highest legitimacy in the international system. And there is a continuous discussion that other kinds of sanctions, and I know also in Geneva it goes on, but other kinds of sanctions are defined as unilateral sanctions, and that they would be against the UN Charter or against the international law. And of course that means sanctions done by the Western countries, for instance, on Russia, are those that are criticized as they are not UN sanctions. And that leads us into the whole issue of how the Security Council functions, and I will not go into that. But as you can see, sanctions has been increasingly popular for a long period of time. Right now, however, one can see a sort of gradual reduction in the number of sanctions regimes imposed by the UN Security Council. And then, of course, we have this whole set of sanctions outside the basic UN framework. When we look at this, we can see that political leaders often underestimate this rallying effect. There is a strong belief in the fact that if we just increase pressure, maximum pressure, as some politicians will talk about, then they will somehow crack. But it's very hard to find typical clear examples that demonstrate that really works. I think my hunch is that it only works under very special conditions, and that is when the society is already divided in different groupings and opposition. One of the key examples of effective sanctions is, for instance, South Africa, where the country was already divided, and then the sanctions, so to say, strengthen these divisions. But in most other conditions, it's more possible for the government to get this rallying effect. When we look at the various cases of sanctions and try to summarize what we learn from them, is that if you pursue the idea of very comprehensive sanctions, these sanctions tend to be very protracted, sometime perhaps along the line still leading to negotiations. The economy of a country that is exposed to these kind of sanctions will gradually adapt to the situation. You can say that typically the more comprehensive sanctions have effects the first year or the first 2 years perhaps. Then after that, the economy starts to adapt to the new conditions, find new ways of getting resources, etc. The hope that is often had is that it will lead to a regime change. It's fairly rare to happen, but it really results in that. And indeed, they have very strong, very clear humanitarian negative effects on the population as a whole. As for the comprehensive sanctions, one can say the targeted sanctions statistically are perhaps not more successful in achieving the compliance than the comprehensive sanctions, but they do achieve results at a much lower cost, particularly avoiding many of the humanitarian consequences of sanctions. They do, of course, have negative effects for particular individuals, and that was very much what we were concerned about in the Stockholm process, so to say the human rights of these individuals that are listed and have their rights been protected or not, which in many of these discussions was the position of the European Union was to protect the human rights, so to say, even of these people. I would still conclude that the sanctions are a cumbersome tool to do. We have some successes. We would have wanted to see much more of this kind of successes. They do succeed to achieve changes that we want in government policies, but under rather special circumstances. I wouldn't really paint a big picture and say that this book says sanctions will always be successful. It leads us instead into a discussion, I think, under what conditions could these sanctions really be helpful and useful. So that leads me to ask whether there are other ways of doing sanctions. So those sanctions I've been talking about so far are basically negative. You put pressure, you break off relationships and hope that that will lead to change. Now, if you formulate negative sanctions, then you realize then we could talk about positive sanctions. What could they be like? Well, they could be various other kinds of measures that signal a different kind of intent. And I've given some examples here from what we have picked up here and there in the negotiations and in the sanctions literatures. And these are largely promises of various sorts, rewards for concessions, etc., to take a much more positive approach. And they have clearly the effect of reducing tension. They change the images of the people involved in the conflict. They may actually be more effective in dividing the target. You get a debate in the targeted country, will we accept these concessions or should we not? And you get a discussion, and that's the kind of division that can be helpful in reaching an agreement. But of course, they do have a lot of negative effects as well. They may make it more unclear what the sender, the initiator of the sanctions really want to achieve. It may also lead to a kind of bargaining where you maybe give in more than you would have wanted. That's the basic message, I think, as I take from these studies, that we need to broaden the discussion, not only just focusing on negative punishing sanctions, but also start to think about what could be the role of positive sanctions in this regard. Let me say that that's, I think, the more general conclusions here. We should finalize our comments by the study that Armend has made on Pakistan as an interesting and understudied case of sanctions and proliferation, where in the end Pakistan went for nuclear weapons. So, Armend, would you like to say a bit on this?
Yeah, just a couple of words. Amongst the chapters in the book, there is a chapter on the case of Pakistan, which is co-written with Rishi Kachawan, a researcher from King's College London, and would only begin by sort of echoing what Peter said earlier, that sanctions are there to achieve certain goals. And really, I think that was really the key question that we wanted to address in this particular chapter, as well as maybe a question that was aimed to be addressed in other chapters, case study related also. Did sanctions achieve the goal in the case of Pakistan? And the answer is very clear, it did not. Here is just a quote, this sort of famous or infamous quote from the foreign minister Ali Bhutto in the 1960s, when asked as to whether Pakistan would develop a nuclear bomb. He said that if India makes an atom bomb, then we will develop one even if we have to eat grass. Paraphrasing. And of course, then we have the first nuclear test in May '98, and currently, actually, the data from 2024 by CIPRI puts the number of warheads in Pakistan at around 200, actually, more than what is currently there on the slide. And so the question that we wanted to address really is that, yes, sanctions, there was throughout the Pakistan's history from 1960s, 70s, particularly 80s and onwards, there were sanctions, unilateral sanctions mostly, these coercive measures specifically by the US and some other actors, but mostly by the US. But they were not sort of consistent in their application. So at some point, there would be sanctions against Pakistani governments, and then there were sort of there was a relief of sanctions because of the changing geopolitical dynamics in the region, what with war against the Taliban, the so-called war on terror, and so on and so forth. So depending on where the sort of allegiances shifted, the sanctions policy of the US vis-a-vis Pakistan also changed. which really led to a very inconsistent application of sanctions, which then eventually also contributed to the aim, the objective of the sanctions not being reached. And as we know today, both countries in that region, India and Pakistan, have nuclear weapons, and very often they sort of mimic in their dynamic, they mimic sort of the Cold War dynamics that were very much alive during the Cold War era in the Western sort of hemisphere. Yeah, that's all I think from my side as far as illustrating with the case study is concerned, and I will probably take the floor now.
Okay, thank you. Since I really can't see, I'll just stand over here. I don't need to, since I'd like to be able to see the people I'm speaking to. So I had I was, as mentioned earlier, was a member of the task force, and I co-authored, I guess, the first chapter in General Observations about International Sanctions. And it was interesting for me. I co-authored it with David Cortright. Some of you, certainly those of you who know the sanctions literature, will know that he collaborated for many, he still does, I think, with George Lopez. You may know Cortright and Lopez as one of the standard classics in the field. And David is a classic peace researcher. And we collaborated on a chapter which is titled Incentivizing Non-Proliferation, Theory, Policy, and Experience. And what David basically wanted to supplement the application of international sanctions by bringing in the full set of positive inducements. And Peter just mentioned a number of them that might be considered the way you might think of various kinds of incentives, rather than always focusing on what David Baldwin calls negative sanctions. This would be more in the category of positive sanctions. It's basically to take bring in the full range of positive inducements and incentives associated with economic statecraft. And of course, it's Baldwin who developed that concept of economic statecraft, looking at the range of different types of economic instruments that could be applied. And so we basically wanted to try to explore integrating negative and positive measures to achieve positive outcomes. So in some ways, it fits with the framework that Peter's already mentioned. So while sanctions ordinarily are defined in terms of taking away or denying access to resources, incentives, or benefits, they're restrictive measures applied for political purposes. And there may be some domestic constituencies that could benefit from greater engagement and might fear sanctions and support non-proliferation and disarmament goals. That's part of the idea behind it. So we basically begin with a review of the literature, and I'm not going to summarize it now. I'll just mention in bullet points, since I have a few slides here, which I'm not keeping as slides. I've just mentioned David Baldwin's classic work on negative and positive sanctions. So we begin by looking at that really quite important early contribution back from the 1980s. And then he came up with an updated version of the book Economic Statecraft in 2020. And then we looked at the work of John Paul Lederach, who talks about the benefits of engagement as opposed to isolation. We oftentimes think about sanctions are restrictions, they're isolating. But looking at the trade-off between different approaches to negotiation, focusing on engagement rather than isolation. We then looked at Denny Benjamin and Steve Simon's work on counterterrorism, talking about integrative approaches to countering terrorism as opposed to isolation approaches. We looked at Jeffrey Katlow's book, Signing Away the Bomb, which focuses on the introduction of security guarantees, although not always working, as we saw in the case of Ukraine, security guarantees and non-proliferation gestures from adversaries or potential adversaries. Then we looked at Vipan Narang's book, Seeking the Bomb, Regional Dynamics, and looking again at external inducements. James Wirtz's work on the role, again, of security assurances, a very current topic for anyone thinking about the future of Russia-Ukraine relations. And then finally, Etel Salangin's work on domestic political models that goes into exploring who benefits from sanctions and who loses from sanctions as part of it. My main contribution to the chapter was to look not at the application of sanctions, but at the potential of relief of sanctions. And so much of the sanctions literature is very sanction-centric. We look at what are the impacts of sanctions. How did sanctions affect certain outcomes? There's not enough consideration, I think, in general. Those of you who've taken my courses on this have heard me say this many times, of the interactive effects between sanctions and other measures. Because sanctions are never applied on their own. People always say, do sanctions work? It's the question that sanction specialists hate, I think, more than any. The answer is yes, sometimes, but not very often. That's not sufficient, but nonetheless, we oftentimes just focus on that instrument and not how sanctions interact with negotiation, mediation efforts, threats of the use of force, applications of the use of force, covert measures. So we need to be less sanction-centric. My recent giving more public talks on sanctions have been sanctions are overused, but they're underutilized. And what I mean by that is that we saw just the UN slide, but if you just look by any other measure of sanctions today, given the Russia sanctions and the whole collection of what I call informal multilateral efforts on the part of the G7 plus with regard to Russia, yes, they're overused, but when I say they're underutilized, one aspect of that underutilization is not thinking about how to add more sanctions, but thinking about how to relieve sanctions to achieve political goals. Now, sanctions are very rarely terminated all at once, well, unless you get a Russia veto on the Security Council, which we've had recently, the case of Mali, but rarely are they're oftentimes gradually reduced over time. And if you start looking at even just the UN cases that we studied quite extensively here at the Graduate Institute with the Targeted Sanctions Consortium research on UN sanctions over the years, you can trace what's happening within regimes over time and how they're actually gradually ratcheted back, oftentimes over a series of long and extensive negotiations at the Security Council. So what I came up with as my contribution to the chapter after we did the literature review was to come up with a menu of sanctions relief. And basically to say to policy practitioners, it's not just a matter of do we lift the sanctions or keep them in place, but basically the question of what are all the different types of measures that could be applied step by step, gradually to relieve or to relax existing sanctions. And so I just first, confidence building measures. Doesn't have to be related to sanctions. It can be any number, and I'm not going to go through all of it. I'll just give the typology, the 8, and if there are questions, we can elaborate later. So classic confidence building measures, some kind of reassurances, symbolic gestures. Second, particularly for countries, mainly the US, think about the relaxation of recommended voluntary measures. When we look at sanctions, there are, of course, the required measures we have that are actually required in a Security Council resolution. Some sanctions measures are conditional, that you should do it if you have reason to suspect that, and then it becomes mandatory. And then most resolutions contain voluntary measures. This is when states are called upon to exercise vigilance with respect to something. And these kinds of measures are oftentimes then adopted as additional measures by the European Union, by the United States, by the UK, by other sanctioning powers, countries or regions. So those additional measures could voluntarily be relaxed. So that's the second. So first, confidence building, then relaxation of voluntary measures. Third, expand exemptions. Lots of ways of expanding exemptions. The carve-out provisions in 2664, a whole series of things that can be done with regard to exemptions. Fourth, selective delistings. Many sanctions regimes have, in some cases, hundreds of individuals listed per regime. You could have some symbolically, if you're going back to Peter's point about dividing, if you have enough knowledge about what's happening in domestic politics, you could use a selective delisting. Of course, you have to think of the consequences for the person who gets off the list. That's more complicated. This is not easy, but I'm just giving you a menu. So selective delistings would be number 4. Number 5 is the introduction of caps or adjustment of caps on sectoral measures. So many sanctions, targeted sanctions, are now on sectors of economic activity. But you could say, well, rather than all the importation of petroleum, allow petroleum imports up to a certain degree, certain amount. Even if you think about the cap applied on Russia, you could actually, on oil pricing from Russia, you could actually think this is another example of the use of a cap on utilizing price mechanisms enforced by insurance agencies. So you could introduce caps, you could adjust the existing caps. Sixth, and I think one of the most underutilized relief measures is sanctions suspensions. So you're not formally lifting a sanction, you're just suspending its implementation for a period of time. You could say, all right, we're going to suspend the application. The US did this with regard to Venezuela, not necessarily with good results for the Biden administration. They suspended the oil export restrictions on Venezuela for a period of time. And when that time elapsed after 6 months, the sanctions automatically went back in place. It's basically snapback in the JCPOA, those of you who follow the Iran sanctions regimes. This is that's my sixth. And suspensions, I've done a separate study just looking at the use of suspensions by the UN. And there's a very high correlation between the use of time-limited suspensions and the effectiveness, using our effectiveness measures in the app. So it's an interesting, it's just a correlation, but it's an suggestive correlation. Then seventh, you've got terminations of existing sanctions measures. Now, that doesn't mean you lift everything all at once. You could lift 60%, 70%. You could take certain sectors, you could go step by step. And then eighth, you could consider additional incentives. So there are there's a very large menu that could be worked with. But I'll conclude with a couple of caveats. There's no fixed linear movement from step one to step two to step three. I mean, in every case is sui generis. You have to look at each case separately. But you could imagine you could jump from 1 to 4 and go back to 2 and then 5 or so on. I don't want to make it sound so linear, but I'm thinking in terms of the very easiest things first and the more difficult at the end. And you can combine them in I think, rather creative ways. And I'll conclude just with a comment that although I've given you a menu, and this is what we highlight in the chapter, we go through this menu of different options for sanctions, utilizing sanctions relief to facilitate negotiations on proliferation and disarmament issues. But it's not easy. Politically, this is very difficult to do. And I'll just conclude with what I call the 4 C's. The first problem is the calibration. And Peter had this on an earlier slide. How much relief do you offer for what concession? Yes, they've agreed to negotiation, but are they serious about it? So this is always the classic bargaining problem. That's the first C. The second is communication. How strategic, how clear are you to the target of what you really want them to do, and how do they understand what you say? You may not understand, may not interpret correctly what they are actually going to do. So that's the second. Communication is the second C. Third, coordination. This is probably the biggest challenge because increasingly, although some of us focus not exclusively but intensively on United Nations sanctions, UN sanctions don't exist in a vacuum. There are US sanctions, there are EU sanctions, we have UK sanctions, we have all these other. So you have to think, if you're trying to negotiate something, you have to coordinate across multiple centers of sanctions internationally, which is a challenge. And then some countries, US in particular, you have to have a domestic discussion between different agencies because what the Treasury Department wants and what the State Department wants and what the intelligence community want may be very different things. Finally, the last C is credible commitments. And here the lessons go back to the Iran sanctions regime and the JCPOA because the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is a wonderful illustration of a step-by-step calibrated sanctions relief for a certain set of agreed upon publicly at IAEA inspections regimes. So the sanctions relief is built into the JCPOA. What those who negotiated JCPOA couldn't deliver on was a credible commitment that international finance would return to Iran after it agreed to the JCPOA. And one of the big problems in listening to the Iranians say, well, look, you promised us this relief, but in fact, the private sector didn't respond. And then you have John Kerry going around exhorting banks, no, you need to invest here and there. Of course, the banks were smart because they maybe anticipated Donald Trump and the U.S. departure from the JCPOA in 2018. Nonetheless, it's just an example of you have to think about, you could agree to relieve something, but just because you relieve it doesn't mean that the private sector is going to rush in and replace it, go to the previous levels. And there's a stickiness about sanctions as well, that once they're in place, it takes a long time to extract yourself. But basically, this is just a set of ideas that we're trying to combine positive incentives, literature on how incentives can work, and then linking that literature to a very specific step-by-step how you could utilize sanctions relief in these different stages. So the menu is limited, of course, by the nature of the sanctions themselves. So if you're dealing with North Korea, DPRK, there's a huge list of things you can do. If you're dealing with Yemen, where you only have individual designations on a very small number of people on one side of the conflict, there's not much to work with. So one has to keep in mind that this menu is more abstract and it varies very much case to case. When sanctions and sanction relief are combined with negotiations, we've learned from another study looking at UN sanctions and UN mediation efforts that sometimes they are complementary, but sometimes these two mechanisms are contradictory, even coming from the same actor, and that's certainly the case within the UN system. So that's a bit of what we do in our second chapter, but I could go on much more detail, which I won't. If there are questions, I'll take you to that. But let me turn things to my colleague Grégoire Mallard to offer some reflections, someone who's worked on proliferation issues for many years and has also worked on sanctions issues for many years. Grégoire, and then we'll open it.
Thank you very much. So my comments are going to be on the spot because I haven't had yet the chance to read the book. And my first comment will be about to comment the scope of the study. It's great to have a systematic study on so many cases. You listed from Federal Republic of Germany to Pakistan to more contemporary cases in Iran. And my first question related to this is about the constraints it puts on your definition of sanctions in order to encapsulate so many different contexts and so many different legal parameters that you may want to study, whether you are dealing with Germany in the 50s, 60s, whether you're dealing with Pakistan in the 80s, 90s, whether you're dealing with Iran in the 2010s. At what level of generality do you want to place your discussions about the effect of sanctions, about the ability of these states to go towards nuclear weapons or not? It seems to me that actually Baldwin's definition of sanction is the one you took, because I heard you about negative and positive sanctions, whereas I would never use the terms positive sanctions coming more from a socio-legal approach. It's very higher political science approach, and it's totally respectable, but I'm wondering the extent to which we lose and that's, if you want to have such a general framework, you have to have some generality, but then the con is that you lose some specificity about what exactly is this mechanism of sanction. And if basically you tend to say it's a mechanism of state intervention that will produce negative consequential effects on the target country. In a sense, that's a very broad definition. Whereas if you want to engage in an interdisciplinary conversation, maybe with a legal scholar, I would tend to think that for him, a legal sanctions first don't exist without a legal framework, because they are a mechanism to enforce compliance with this legal framework. And here then the question may be immediately, what sort of legal framework are we talking about? Are we talking about a bilateral framework? For instance, a lot of non-inducements to not go towards nuclear weapons during the Cold War were done at the beginning until the NPT through bilateral agreements. Basically, the US, which was the main exporter of nuclear technologies, will have specific conditionalities that no diversion of the nuclear material would go toward military activities. There would be some sanctions within this bilateral. We would take the nuclear, we will stop exports, and we will take the nuclear material back. Would there be other retaliation? It depends on the bilateral treaty itself. In some cases, the reaction would be more or less close, whether it's a non-aligned country, whether it's like India, whether it's in the line like the French or the British. So you would have to look at the enforcement mechanism within the treaty itself. Of course, the NPT has another mechanism, Euratom has another mechanism, and will they be called sanctions? It's up to the legal scholars community to think about it in these terms. So that's my first question, is to what extent can we produce generalizable lessons that do not take into account the legal specificity of the enforcement mechanism itself and the legal context in which this is situated. For instance, one of the mechanisms through which, the case of Germany, I have in mind, where they somehow definitively renounced nuclear weapons, come with the Moscow Treaty, which settled the Cold War and says you can reunify, but you cannot ever have nuclear weapons. Is there a sanctions mechanism in the Moscow Treaty? Not really. Then it's up to the UN Security Council to then decide. So that's my first question: at what point, at what level of generality can you place the discussion on sanctions to have generalizable lessons about the effect on proliferation? And the second question that I have, which is related with this question of how can you compare these cases, is what is the timeline you take? Do you take the same timeline for each case? Or do you focus on these sequences of, I don't know, 20 years during which the country starts to acquire nuclear civilian technologies and then maybe is tempted toward divert these technologies toward military uses? Or do you start with the same point? The same point being maybe the late 30s, early 40s, when there was a global attempt, a global race to the bomb, with, as you said, German scientists, where the Manhattan Project was there, already the Russians, and do you start all your case studies at that point, looking through, for instance, India, the process of decolonization? We know that this process of decolonization is actually key to the creation of a will to get the most advanced weaponry that the West and the Communist bloc have acquired? Or do you focus only on certain sequences without taking into basically ignoring the changes in the global context? And what problems does it raise if this is the latter approach you're taking? Because of course, the interactions that Tom was talking about are going to be much more complex to consider when you're talking about Iran in the 2000-2010, when the field has been super legalized, where the NPT is no longer a moratorium for 25 years, but a permanent commitment to not divert, which is only obtained in 1995. So during the 1970 to 1995, the NPT meant something different than it meant since 1995. So how can you control for these changes in the global context if you're applying your lessons at the level of the sequencing and not at the level of the whole period? I'm not saying these are easy questions, and there will be pros and cons, whatever choices you make, but it would be interesting to understand what made you choose your solution to the problems. And relatedly, in a sense, I wanted to say, to include what I heard from Tom's presentation. These questions have an effect on this issue of sanctions lifting, because of course, if you think of sanctions as an enforcement mechanism to convince a state to abide by its legal commitments, the goal is to gradually think about the sanctions lifting so that the country goes back to its non-proliferation agreements, if we're thinking about the NPT signatories. and if we exclude India, Israel, and others who are these so-called de facto nuclear weapon states. Because here again, sanctions lifting, if we take two examples, India and Iran. India, until the explosions of the 90s, for a long time, between the explosion of a peaceful nuclear device until the nuclear test of a military device in the 90s, was formally not under sanctions. There was no UN sanctions. There was not even US sanctions. Kissinger was very careful to say, we're not going to apply sanctions. What we're going to do is build a system of soft law through nuclear experts groups that say that if you are in a position that looks like India, we exclude you from this nuclear suppliers group. Okay. So, and then de facto, we are going to change the soft law, and de facto, we're going to have to incorporate this new legal context in our legislation because we're a law-abiding country. And de facto, we have to stop the contracts we may have contemplated with you and stop the existing contracts. So it's not sanction, it's more evolution of the soft law environment and then adaptation of the domestic context. So of course, the way you get outside of this is very different from sanctions lifting because it's not technically sanctions. So that was actually the negotiation during the Bush year to have a 1, 2, 3 agreement between US and India that says, well, basically we have created this soft law agreement, but we'll find a way through NSG certification and then somehow an IAEA green light that we will be able to export again to your nuclear civilian sector if you put this nuclear civilian sector under some type of ad hoc full scope agreement with the IAEA, and we all agree to not look at what you have on top of it. But it's a very different type. I wouldn't call it a sanctions lifting agreement, but it's basically a negotiation that tries to lift some self-imposed measures to bring back India into the community of nuclear civilian exchange. So I'm wondering then if the lessons you have drawn from your examination of case, sort of how the sanctions lifting or some type of lifting measures related to sanctions would apply to something that is not called sanctions, this India case, but that would be maybe expand the typology a bit further. And here, again, the whole question is, do we have to have a narrow definition of sanctions, or should we have a broad definition of sanctions in order to build this typology? Thank you for the book.
Excellent.
It looks very interesting.
Great comments and difficult questions. I want to open it up, but maybe just quickly, first reaction to Grégoire's posed two specific questions, one about the generalizability of some of the findings with regard to the case selection and the other about timelines. And I've got a response on Baldwin, but I'll come back to that later. But yeah, briefly, and then we'll open it up. I'm going to push I know we're supposed to end in 10 minutes, but we'll push it forward another 15 if you'll bear with. There is a reception afterwards. So I can say that if you stay through there, you'll be rewarded. So sorry, Pete.
It's the application of positive sanctions.
And that's exactly positive inducements right there.
Yeah, no, I thought, Grégoire, you made some really interesting comments, which are really worthwhile to look more carefully at. I think in terms of what is, so to say, a sanctions unit that we look at that is comparable over time. And that's the work that Tom has done, trying to define, so to say, sanction episodes. And I think they start from where one party sort of mentions or raises the issue of possible sanctions until application. So that you can define fairly easy, I think. and make it in such a way that they are comparable. We can discuss that. I think it's more difficult to identify, so to say, episodes of non-proliferation, because it's a non-thing happening. So for how long time should you really study, and when do sanctions come in? So I think that requires a completely different set of thinking. India, Pakistan, these are programs that go on for a long time, or Iran, etc. So when did they start? What should one regard as a start, and what are the changes during that period of time? And then you have sanctions coming in at various junctures. So I think that's a real challenge, particularly if you take the case of Germany, which I find really something we have not looked carefully at, and I think one should, because the way politics is developing in Germany, there is even now voices about why don't Germany have a nuclear weapon if Britain has one and France has one. So I think we need to go back to the kind of deal that Germany made back in the 1960s, which allowed, then, as I said, nuclear industry to develop, but prevented the application. And Germany could probably, if it breaks out of this agreement, which would be a real disaster, it could probably develop a nuclear weapon very quickly. The other thing you mentioned, which I thought was really interesting, and that is the comparability over this whole time. We are taking these cases and sort of comparing them as if they are taking place at the same time. But in fact, they do come, as you mentioned, during different periods, 1940s, 50s, 70s, 80s, 2020s, etc. But I think one can handle that by regarding this as different time. You can ask what are the typical thing of these various times and say, have that as a background. If you have sanctions during a Cold War situation compared to when there is much more cooperative major power relationships, and again, when there is less of cooperations, you can see if that factor really has an impact. So I think that factor is actually manageable in some sense. But indeed, there are difficulties. And that's why it's a challenge, and that's why more people should be concerned about doing research on sanctions.
No, just to complement what Peter said, I was quite intrigued by Grégoire's sort of question, but also suggestion in regards to the evolution of the soft law, right, on sanctions, right? The book, insofar as sort of defining exactly what we mean by sanctions, of course, we touch upon it, but of course, we don't have a sort of conclusive idea in terms of the question at hand. Tom's and David's chapter specifically talk about the theory and the definitions. We refer to Baldwin. We referred here also to positive versus negative sanctions, coercive or inducements or otherwise. But I think what we could work further on is, as a kind of academic community, is regardless of whether the government, an ex-government, in this case the US, calls specific policies sanctions or not, it would be incumbent upon us to perhaps kind of conceptualize a framework within which we categorize certain actions or policies of governments as inducements or relief or measures or otherwise. I think this is sort of an area of work which is still, I think, to be explored further. And personally, I think on the question of expanding the typology of sanctions, that's what sort of particularly intrigued me. Yeah.
I'll come back later. Let me open it up now to any questions, comments, reflections, challenges. Please. And let me ask you to, I know many of you, but not everyone, so introduce yourself and tell us.
Yes, hi everyone, this is Wade, and I'm a recent graduate from the Graduate Institute. I want to ask it more realist questions, and I'm really keen to know your opinions on the current situations on DPRK and how sanctions would use as an effective tool for its, the non-proliferation regimes and its disarmament. Because I'm asking this because based on the recent development, because we see there was like a briefing on Security Council a few weeks ago concerning DPRK's recent launch on missiles at the end of October. And then on the Security Council briefing, you see basically those P3 members, the Russia, China, and US have been pointing fingers at each other. And then you also see how DPRK, they don't think they're doing anything wrong. They say they're using everything they could use to defend its sovereign independence and their sovereign right to defend itself. And you see there's like it's not just, I think I am more like a pessimistic view on on this current situation in the politics of the Security Council. You cannot even have this council members to agree on one of this very important sanction regimes, also given on the recent dissolvement of the panel of experts from the DPRK panel of experts groups. And how can you further monitor the process on this DPRK non-proliferation regimes? And then I'm just curious to know how you anticipate, if I may use the word, that the future of you see if at the end the DPRK case will just be categorized as one of the failures you mentioned in your presentation before, or you still see there's a hopes to bring the DPRK onto the table again. Because I also remember during the briefing, the US was saying clearly that we're not going to reward on DPRK if they're returning back to the table. So you see this is a clear dead end right now on the table. And I just know if you have any, based on the menus you just provided, if there's any incentives that you can push DPRK to make it work again, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of questions. Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Johanna Möhring. I'm a visiting fellow at the Graduate Institute, and there's proliferation of books on sanctions. So I assisted already on the first launch, which took a while back, place in October. And one of the things that was raised there was the just sheer number of sanctions and the many actors that were producing them. And basically that there was no more any clarity to even know the interactions between the regimes. And yes, I just wanted to probe you on this particular point, which you raised in your presentation as well, but just to highlight that I would basically make this an even more increasingly difficult tool to wield.
Anyone else from around the table at this point? Anyone from the online audience? I can see a number of names I recognize. From some of them I don't, because I can't read that far from here. I guess it's up here too. Sorry, closer. Anyone of the online wish to unmute and pose a question? No pressure. We don't force people to have their cameras.
Hello, I have a question. My name's Neil Boone. I'm with CCDP. And maybe it doesn't relate exactly to nuclear sanctions, but in the
speak a little louder,
the new US administration is using tariffs as a punishment and policy tool. And I'm wondering how you see their comparative effectiveness vis-a-vis sanctions, even if they're not talking about using it with respect to nuclear proliferation issues, though who knows, that may happen in the future.
Thank you. Okay, we've got three questions on the table. The first one about DPRK, the second about the sheer number of sanctions, and the third, I guess it's echoing the recent U.S. campaign when the successful candidate said he didn't like sanctions, but he liked tariffs. Anyway, I'm going to comment on that, but first, those are the three. Peter first.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting and very difficult question. The easiest one is the second one, the question about the sheer number of sanctions. And I sometimes feel a bit guilty that we produced this report to the UN Security Council about making sanctions more effective by targeting and how to do it. And we were, of course, thinking about that in the UN context. But it seems like those ideas have proliferated, so to say. So everybody seems now to be engaged in doing it. The number of people that are listed on some kind of sanctions is now just extraordinarily long. And that was never the idea that it should be like that. But it relates back to a question Grégoire had about what we mean with sanctions. Of course, in the UN, it's easier. There you have a legal instrument called sanctions, so that's easier. But if you take the European Union, it does not have sanctions. They talk about restrictive measures, and which of course can include many other kind of things that we would normally include. So in that sense, by going outside, so to say, the UN established notion of sanctions, you create more and more measures of various sorts. And some of these can probably be helpful, but in many ways it creates an increasing confusion. I think there is a little in what Tom said, that the sanctions are today overused in some sense. They are, you said underused, but I think
they're overused and underutilized.
Underutilized. Yeah, I think that there is a very easy, quick resort to these sanctions, and too easy, I think. I think if one were going to do this correctly, we should make a real good analysis of each case and see are the sanctions really going to work here, and what kind of countermeasures is likely to take place against the sanctions, so that you know that you are investing a lot of energy in something that really will have an impact. So I'm a little worried about this enormous amount of sanctions happening. And I'm worried for another reason too, because it's like we are wasting a potentially useful instrument. We're wasting it without not achieving what we could do. I've been thinking, talking about being realistic, I've been thinking, how could the world react if Russia puts a tiny but still nuclear weapon on a village or town in Ukraine? How can the world react? And obviously, it's not many things the world can do, because sanctions have already been used and are, so to say, wasted. And there is really very little other than going to some kind of counter-military action. So in that sense, we need also to keep these kind of instruments available for even worse cases than the one we are seeing. And I'm afraid that we are not doing that. I'm really worried that we will see such a use of a nuclear weapons. DPRK, yes, indeed. I've seen this idea that in the back would be some kind, to the table, to discussion, would be some kind of reward. I think what we see here is even worse. I mean, here we see Russia as a member of the Security Council imposing these sanctions, in fact, disobeying its own sanctions and undermining them by all the various cooperative agreements one is now making with North Korea. So I think in reality, it becomes also a case where it's only some parts of the world that are applying sanctions, and other important part of the world is not. And going with the argument you said, I mean, we are an independent country, we have the right to defending ourselves. I think here one really needs to rethink how to relate to North Korea, and perhaps the only realistic thing is to accept the fact that they have these nuclear weapons and define them in some way, in some kind of category of de facto nuclear weapon state, but in return get some kind of right to relate to North Korea in some constructive way. I see sort of a negotiation like that. Wouldn't regard it as sort of a reward, but as something understanding what the world actually looks like. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So, I could jump in on a couple of them. I want to go back to the definition in Baldwin. Why book economic statecraft is so important, I think, in the sanctions literature is because he does have a whole series of rather precise definitions. And these days, there's so much popular discourse about sanctions as economic warfare. I'm thinking of Nicholas Mulder's recent book. And it's very clear if you read Baldwin, he makes a clear distinction that this is not what you would do in a formally declared war. This is not economic warfare. That's a different category. So you're right to put your finger on how are you defining it. And so I think Baldwin is definitely, chapter 4, a good read for our students interested in definitions of sanctions, very important read analytically. I don't usually use positive sanctions myself. I don't think of that as it's a bit intuitive, but I do want to defend Baldwin and the importance of it. I do have a definition of sanctions that is closer to legal definition. I define sanctions as restrictive measures applied for political goals. So sanctions are not, tariffs are not sanctions. So in that sense, so that maybe getting to one of the online question a moment ago, because they're typically for economic, but the boundary between political and economic is fuzzy oftentimes, but anyway, just for definitions. And so therefore, I say restrictive measures is much better than economic restrictions, because if we have an economist in the room, they'll only focus on economic restrictive measures. They won't talk about a travel ban. They won't think about restrictive diplomatic restrictions. I've co-authored with economists on this and had this battle with them, so I know exactly what it's like. And when I teach here, I'll have students from economics, from law, and from political science, some from sociology as well. And I've now sided with the lawyers. I think they've got it right. They are restrictive measures. And the word sanctions, by the way, doesn't appear in the charter, the UN charter, even though the UN applies sanctions. So they are technically restrictive measures of a variety of sorts. Anyway, too much on that. My response to your second really interesting question, they're both interesting questions, but would be a general response that really does need some serious thinking, maybe a sequel for our working group, and that would be a periodization. Thinking of, you were touching on it, Peter was answering it in that way, but thinking of the Cold War era, the immediate post-Cold War era, when we had finally the UN appearing to be an effective collective security organization for the first time since its founding, and where we are today. That's at least a very true, and you've already identified that, but you might even get into other types of context, regional. But I think that would be the way of responding, because I think there is a danger to be too political as science-y. We have all these cases drawn from history across randomly, and of course they're all the same. Of course, I don't know, each case is unique. I also accept that point. I'm a long critic of behavioral science methods on that side of things, but except the very careful work done in the conflict database in Uppsala. But differentiating in India 75 and 98. They're different worlds, absolutely, and that's, I think, your main point. To AU, DPRK, yeah, well, we're setting, I've recently made a recommendation, actually, for a way forward, if anyone's interested, and that is for the U.S. to stop playing the same card, which is add more sanctions on DPRK every time it launches a missile. China and Russia have put forward a counter resolution that calls for sanctions relief on humanitarian grounds, but that's wrong-headed as well, because they didn't link it at all to any kinds of restrictions on the nuclear program, even first steps toward denuclearization, which I think today one needs to think about DPRK in terms of arms control. The genie's out of the bottle. I mean, it is an effective nuclear state. It's failed. So therefore, we need to shift the agenda and get the U.S. and Russia and China to work together. Well, maybe the U.S. and China have more, but now even that, never mind. We've got dueling resolutions at this point, and it's completely dysfunctional. That's my take on it. But my simple solution would be to actually link the sanctions relief to specific measures toward arms control. Actually, the last time I was on a webinar with Russian scholars working on DPRK, that was their view as well. So, I mean, I'm not sure the Russian government these days is playing a role. That's another story in the Security Council. But I think there are colleagues in Russia who are thinking along the same lines. Sheer number, absolutely. 12,000. Actually, even if you go to the OFAC U.S. government website for the number of individual designations, they say about 12,000. They don't even have a precise number of how many people they've sanctioned. The EU is now in the 4,000 to 6,000 range. UK will be catching up shortly. So you're absolutely right just about the numbers and the complexity. And this is why any kind of coordinated effort to utilize them more effectively is going to be, because even someone like Abramovich in Russia isn't on the US list, he's on the EU and UK list for very particular political reasons. So the whole matter of how would you negotiate sanctions relief when it's a very complicated story. So the sheer number makes it very difficult. Actually, I want to disagree slightly with Peter, because on Russia, people always say these are such massive and widespread, the most dramatic sanctions. They're not. There are a lot of parts of, there are many opportunities for expanding the Russia sanctions. So I don't think that card's been fully played. At least if you look at, there's a lot of hyperbole about the Russia sanctions, where people call them the most extensive, and it's what's significant about the Russia sanctions, from my view, is that they're the widest set of sanctions applied to a country so previously integrated with the world economy. That's what's really distinctive about it. And the country that has the capacity to respond and retaliate with countermeasures that really hurt, called oil and gas. And so that's what's really unique about it. Not actually the range of measures, because DPRK has a far more extensive set of sanctions from the UN. Iran has a far more extensive set of sanctions than Russia today. So I think that's why we're in package, I think 15 now in preparation at the EU level. They're being ratcheted. It's 14 now, I think. Someone think it's 14. Yeah. 14, yeah. I know I think, but they're working on the 15th. That's so. Once you've got one out, you're working on the next one. So that's part of the logic, I think. And on tariffs as a punishment, yeah, it's an interesting point. I think Mr. Trump, well, there are many things I believe he doesn't really understand. And I think the distinction between sanctions and tariffs is one of them. But when you talk about tariffs as punishments, you have to ask the question of who's being punished. Oftentimes it's the person applying the tariffs on their own people. The people, that's the American public will suffer from the tariffs, not necessarily the target of the tariffs themselves. I've gone on too long and I exceeded my role as moderator. Any last questions, rebuttals, critiques?
Can I just
add carry on the debate here?
On the question of people that are on the list?
Yeah.
I mean, we made a study where we had about 500 people on the UN lists and that were targeted in terms of them being involved in civil wars. Right. And then there was another 500 on the terrorist list. But those who were on the civil war, we could actually identify who they were. And we asked the question, have they seemingly changed their opinion on something? Because, of course, that's the idea with the sanctions. And we could interview some of them. And there was really very little. One was a minister in the government that he actually left. But he said, when I was in government and was getting these sanctions on myself, it became a loyalty measure. That if I would then start to object to what the government as a whole is doing, I would be illoyal. So I had to play along, etc. So the sanctions don't necessarily, these negative sanctions don't necessarily have that ability to split and divide, which of course is the old Roman way of running things. It's to divide and rule rather than push people together and try to rule. So I think there is something interesting to be learned. Although those 12,000, I'm sure we could pick out some of them and see how they actually react. And the typical thing is that they will move their yachts from British ports to Turkish ports, etc.
UAE.
UAE, yeah. I mean, one has to include that in the sanctions constantly. That the other side is not sitting by and waiting for them to have an impact. No, they are acting and moving around and need to have that as part of the analysis before the apply the sanctions. That's my main conclusion.
Perfect, great. I mean, I thought you were going to cite your work on Cote d'Ivoire.
Well, we could, yeah.
Yeah, because you did that. It was a really interesting study. Was that with Corinna Stefano, I think?
Yeah, it was Myrdal. Yeah.
Myrdal, yeah, exactly. We found that actually people in Cote d'Ivoire said the wrong people had been sanctioned, actually, for the most part. So one has to think through how these play out politically.
We do have drinks waiting for us, so maybe we could keep the discussion going.
Let's do that. Thank you. I was going to close. Although if people want to buy the book, you didn't put this on the slide. You get a 20% discount with the following code, AFLY03. So I just put that out there for your marketing. I brought the 20% discount form with me if anyone wants to get 20% off on the book. But you can actually just have a drink with the authors right now, and it's down in Pedal 1. Is that where we're going? Okay. Pedal 1 in the lobby, main entrance to the main building of the Graduate Institute. Thanks very much for your attendance. Thanks for